I had spent my entire life earning a place at my family's table, but on the night of our annual family dinner, my daughter-in-law looked straight at a uniformed security guard, pointed at me as though I were a stranger, and said, "Remove this beggar from my table." For a heartbeat, the room became so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the chandelier above us and the faint clink of silverware settling against china. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I was 69 years old that evening. I had buried my husband, Richard, almost 3 years earlier, yet every family gathering still carried echoes of the traditions we had built together over 4 decades. Richard believed that no matter how busy life became, families should always find time to sit together over a warm meal. He used to say that a dinner table revealed more truth than any courtroom because people eventually showed who they really were once the food was served and the conversation settled. I remembered those words as I stood just inside the private dining room of Hawthorne House, one of the nicest restaurants in our county. The room smelled of fresh bread, roasted herbs, and polished oak. A long table stretched beneath soft golden lights. Every chair was filled except the one waiting for me. My son, Michael, had insisted that this dinner celebrate the growth of our family's business investments. He sounded excited on the phone a week earlier. "Mom, it wouldn't feel complete without you," he had said. I believed him because mothers often choose hope over suspicion. I spent the afternoon preparing as carefully as I had prepared for holidays throughout Michael's childhood. I selected a navy blue dress Richard always said made my eyes look brighter. I pinned on the pearl brooch he gave me on our 40th wedding anniversary. Before leaving the house, I stood for a moment beside Richard's photograph on the fireplace mantel. "Wish me luck," I whispered with a small smile. "You always knew how to keep everyone together." During the drive, memories accompanied me more faithfully than any passenger. I remembered teaching Michael to ride his bicycle along our quiet suburban street. I remembered helping him study late into the night before college exams. I remembered every overtime shift Richard and I worked so our son could graduate without crushing debt. Those memories warmed me far more than the heater inside my sedan. When I arrived, several relatives greeted me politely. A few cousins smiled. My grandchildren waved from across the room before Ashley quietly redirected their attention toward another conversation. It was subtle enough that many people probably never noticed. I noticed because little things had become familiar over the past several years. A changed seating arrangement here. A forgotten invitation there. A holiday dinner moved without telling me until the last minute. None of those moments seemed large enough to confront on their own. Together, they formed a picture I had tried very hard not to see. Ashley approached wearing an elegant cream-colored dress that matched the expensive decor around her. She smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "You're here," she said, her voice perfectly pleasant on the surface. "Of course," I answered. "Michael invited me." She nodded without another word and turned away. I found my place card near the end of the table. Not beside my son. Not near my grandchildren. Almost hidden behind a decorative flower arrangement where half the guests would barely notice I was present. I quietly adjusted the chair and sat down anyway. Richard had taught me long ago that dignity was something no one could hand you and no one could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. Dinner began. Servers carried plates of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and warm dinner rolls. Glasses clinked as people toasted new beginnings, future investments, and family success. Michael laughed at stories from his business partners. Ashley moved effortlessly through conversations, accepting compliments as though she were hosting the evening herself. Every now and then I caught my son's eyes drifting toward me, but each time he quickly looked away. It felt less like embarrassment and more like avoidance. I told myself not to overthink it. Then it happened. One of the servers politely asked if anyone needed another chair adjusted. Ashley looked directly toward me, her expression suddenly colder than I had ever seen before. She lifted one perfectly manicured finger in my direction and called across the room, loud enough for every conversation to stop. "Security," she said calmly, "remove this beggar from my table." At first I honestly believed I had misunderstood her. Surely she was joking. Surely someone would laugh and say she had gone too far. No one laughed. The security guard standing near the entrance looked uncertain. His eyes moved from Ashley to me, then toward Michael, silently waiting for direction. My son lowered his gaze to his plate. He didn't object. He didn't smile either. He simply said nothing. In that silence, I learned more about my family than I had in the previous 10 years. I slowly reached for my purse, stood up, and gently straightened the sleeves of my jacket. My heartbeat remained surprisingly steady. Humiliation has a strange way of becoming peaceful once it grows too heavy to resist. As I walked toward the door, the security guard quietly stepped aside instead of blocking my path. He gave me the smallest respectful nod, almost an apology without words. I returned it with a faint smile. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around me like an old friend. I climbed into my car, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and sat there without starting the engine. Then I picked up my phone, scrolled to a number I had never imagined needing, and made a single call that would quietly change every future family dinner forever. I sat inside my car for several minutes with the engine still silent, watching the warm lights from the restaurant glow through the windshield. Guests continued laughing behind those tall windows as though nothing unusual had happened. It amazed me how quickly life continued for people who had not been humiliated. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, although inside I felt as though the foundation beneath 42 years of family memories had quietly shifted. I finally pressed the call button beside the name Daniel Brooks. Richard had trusted Daniel for nearly 3 decades. He was more than an attorney. He had become a family friend, the sort of man who remembered birthdays, asked about grandchildren, and always called my husband by his first name instead of Mr. Carter. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Evelyn, it is good to hear from you. Is everything all right?" I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "I think it is finally time for us to have that conversation Richard told me might become necessary one day." Silence filled the line for a few seconds. Daniel did not sound surprised. "Can you come by my office tomorrow morning?" he asked gently. 9 o'clock? "I will be there," I replied before ending the call. The drive home took almost half an hour. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every familiar street reminded me of another season of life. There was the elementary school where Michael had proudly carried home his first science project. There was the grocery store where Richard used to insist on buying fresh flowers every Friday because he believed ordinary weeks deserved beautiful endings too. There was the neighborhood park where our grandchildren once begged me to push them higher on the swings before Ashley slowly began finding reasons why they were suddenly too busy to visit. I pulled into my driveway just after 9 in the evening. My house looked exactly as it always had. The white porch light glowed softly over the front steps. The flower beds I still cared for every Saturday framed the walkway with neat rows of lavender and white roses. Richard planted those roses during our 25th wedding anniversary because he wanted something beautiful that would outlive both of us. They had. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet that had become both my comfort and my companion since losing him. Some people think silence feels empty. They have never shared a life with someone whose love still echoes through every room. I hung my jacket in the hallway closet, placed my purse on the entry table, and instinctively glanced toward Richard's old reading chair. His favorite blanket remained folded neatly across the armrest exactly where I had left it. I had considered moving it many times, but every attempt felt like erasing another piece of him. Instead, I learned to live alongside the memories rather than hide from them. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it into the living room. The clock above the fireplace ticked steadily, filling the room with the same comforting rhythm that had accompanied countless evenings together. Richard often sat across from me reading financial reports while I worked on crossword puzzles or knitted blankets for church charity drives. Neither of us needed constant conversation. Peace had always been enough. I looked toward his framed photograph on the mantel. He wore the same gentle smile that had convinced strangers to trust him almost immediately. "You saw people so clearly," I whispered. "I wish I had listened more carefully when you tried to warn me." Near the bookshelf stood an old cedar cabinet that Richard kept meticulously organized. After he passed away, I had rarely opened its lower drawer because it contained folders, journals, and personal papers that still carried his handwriting. Tonight something pulled me toward it. I knelt down, slid open the drawer, and carefully lifted a worn leather portfolio. Inside were photographs spanning nearly 50 years. There was Michael at 6 years old holding a baseball glove that was almost larger than he was. Another showed our first family camping trip in the Smoky Mountains, where rain had soaked our tent, yet somehow those became our favorite memories. I smiled despite everything that had happened only hours earlier. The boy in those photographs had once hugged me every morning before school without anyone reminding him. He had saved allowance money to buy me a birthday card that proudly declared I was the best mother in the world. Somewhere between those memories and tonight's dinner, that little boy had slowly disappeared behind responsibilities, ambition, and influences I had been unwilling to question. As I continued sorting through the portfolio, a small cream-colored envelope slipped onto the hardwood floor. My name was written across the front in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. I stared at it without opening it immediately. I remembered the evening he sealed that envelope. It had been about 6 months before his heart attack. We were sitting together on the back porch watching the sunset fade across the trees when he suddenly became unusually serious. "If life ever places you in a position where kindness is mistaken for weakness," he had said quietly, "promise me you will not surrender your dignity just to keep the peace." At the time I laughed and asked whether he had been reading too many legal thrillers. He only smiled and placed the envelope into the cabinet himself. "You may never need this," he told me. "In fact, I hope you never do. But if the day comes when you begin questioning the people around you, open it." I slowly traced my fingers across the envelope but stopped before breaking the seal. Whatever Richard had left inside could wait until after I spoke with Daniel. My husband had always believed that important decisions should never be made in the middle of emotional storms. For the first time since leaving the restaurant, I felt something stronger than sadness settling quietly inside me. It was not anger. It was clarity. Someone had mistaken my silence for surrender, and tomorrow would become the first step toward correcting that misunderstanding. I barely slept that night. The envelope remained unopened on the coffee table where I had left it, illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp beside Richard's favorite chair. Every time I considered breaking the seal, I remembered his calm voice reminding me that patience had protected our family far more often than emotion ever had. When dawn finally arrived, pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the polished countertops. For nearly 40 years, Richard had risen before sunrise to brew coffee while I prepared breakfast. Even after retirement, he never broke that habit. The coffee always smelled richer when he made it. That morning I prepared only a single cup. The quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt observant, almost as though the house itself had been waiting for me to notice things I had ignored for years. After breakfast I walked through the living room carrying my coffee and paused beside a large wall filled with framed family photographs. I had looked at those pictures thousands of times, yet I suddenly found myself studying them differently. In the earliest photographs, Michael stood close beside me, his arm wrapped around my shoulders with the effortless affection only children possess. Then Ashley entered the pictures several years later. At first, nothing appeared unusual. She smiled brightly, complimented everyone, and insisted on taking photographs during every holiday gathering. Gradually, however, subtle changes became impossible to ignore. Somehow I had been moved farther from the center in almost every new picture. Sometimes Ashley stood between Michael and me. Sometimes she suggested that grandparents should sit while younger people stood around them, creating just enough distance to separate us naturally. I remembered laughing at the time, believing she simply enjoyed organizing people. Looking back now, each photograph looked less like a memory and more like quiet evidence of a pattern I had refused to acknowledge. Other memories surfaced without invitation. 3 years earlier, shortly after Richard's funeral, I had offered to host Thanksgiving for the family, hoping familiar traditions might ease everyone's grief. Ashley had smiled warmly and told me she did not want me to carry such a burden so soon after losing my husband. She insisted she would host instead. I spent hours baking Richard's favorite pecan pie and drove across town with careful hands, determined not to let the filling spill during the trip. When I arrived, dinner had already begun. Ashley apologized with surprising ease, explaining that everyone had become hungry and decided not to wait. I accepted her explanation because grief had left me too exhausted to question anyone's intentions. Another memory followed. My oldest granddaughter, Emma, had invited me to her elementary school music performance. She had whispered excitedly over the telephone that she hoped I would sit where she could see me. The evening before the concert, Ashley called and politely informed me that the school had changed the performance time by an hour. I trusted her completely. The next afternoon Emma phoned, disappointed that I had missed the concert. The school had never changed the schedule. Ashley later laughed it off as a simple misunderstanding. Michael believed her without hesitation, and I convinced myself there was no reason to create unnecessary conflict. Then came Christmas the following year. Ashley explained that they wanted to keep the holiday gathering very small because several relatives had developed seasonal colds. I respected the decision and spent Christmas afternoon quietly reading beside the fireplace. 2 days later one of my church friends mentioned seeing photographs online of a lively gathering at Michael's house with cousins, neighbors, co-workers, and friends filling every room. Again I said nothing. I told myself families became busy. I told myself expectations caused disappointment. I told myself love required forgiveness. Perhaps what I truly lacked was the courage to admit I had become an outsider in the family Richard and I had spent our lives building. As those memories gathered together, they fit like pieces of a puzzle that had remained scattered across my heart for years. None of the individual moments seemed large enough to confront. Together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Ashley had never openly declared that I was unwelcome until the previous evening. Instead, she had patiently created a new reality, one polite excuse at a time. Each small exclusion seemed insignificant until there were enough of them to erase my place almost completely. What troubled me even more was Michael's silence. Ashley could influence many things, but she could never replace the values Richard and I had worked so hard to teach our son. Somewhere along the way, Michael had stopped asking himself whether something was kind before deciding whether it was convenient. That realization hurt far more deeply than Ashley's words ever could. At 8:30 I placed Richard's unopened envelope into my handbag beside a small leather notebook where I had begun writing dates and memories as they returned to me. Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth deserved clarity. I put on the same pearl brooch Richard had given me years earlier, looked once more at his photograph, and smiled gently. "You always said that character reveals itself slowly," I whispered. "I finally understand what you meant." A few minutes later I locked the front door behind me and drove toward Daniel Brooks's office, carrying far more than a sealed envelope. I was carrying decades of overlooked moments that had finally found their place in a story I was only beginning to understand. I arrived at Daniel Brooks's office 5 minutes early, just as Richard had always taught me to do. The building stood on a quiet corner of downtown, its red brick exterior unchanged despite the years that had passed. Richard used to joke that Daniel refused to renovate because dependable people did not need fashionable offices to earn trust. As I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh coffee greeted me. The receptionist smiled warmly the moment she recognized me. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Brooks is expecting you." Her kindness felt genuine, and after the previous evening, even a simple smile carried unexpected weight. Daniel was already standing when I entered his office. His silver hair had grown thinner since Richard's funeral, but his handshake remained steady. He walked around his desk instead of waiting for me to approach, then gently placed both hands on my shoulders. "I wish this meeting were under happier circumstances," he said quietly. "So do I," I answered. But I believe Richard knew this day might eventually come. Daniel nodded slowly before inviting me to sit beside the large window overlooking the courthouse square. He did not rush into legal documents. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee exactly the way Richard preferred, black with no sugar. For a moment it felt as though my husband might walk through the door carrying one of his worn leather briefcases. Daniel finally spoke. "Richard came to see me several times during the last year of his life. At first I assumed he wanted to update estate planning because of retirement. Later I realized he was preparing for something else. I listened without interrupting. Did he tell you what worried him? Daniel folded his hands together. He never accused anyone directly. That was not his nature. But he told me he had begun noticing changes inside the family that could not be explained by ordinary misunderstandings. He believed influence was replacing respect, and silence was replacing honesty. My heart tightened because those words sounded exactly like Richard. He had never judged people quickly. When he became concerned, it was only after months of careful observation. Daniel reached into a locked cabinet and removed a thick navy folder with Richard Carter written neatly across the front. He placed it on the table without opening it immediately. Your husband left very specific instructions. He told me this folder was not to be discussed unless you personally contacted me after experiencing a serious breach of trust within the family. I slowly reached into my handbag and removed the sealed envelope Richard had left inside the cedar cabinet. I found this last night, I said. Daniel studied the handwriting before giving a small knowing smile. Then he wanted the timing to be your decision, not his. I carefully broke the seal for the first time. Inside rested a single handwritten letter. Richard's familiar script covered both sides of the page, each line as neat as the day he wrote it. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, something has happened that finally convinced you to stop doubting your own instincts. I pray I was wrong when I prepared these papers, but hope has never been a substitute for wisdom. You have always believed that love can solve every misunderstanding. That is one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Unfortunately, kindness sometimes attracts people who mistake it for weakness. If that day ever comes, promise me you will not respond with anger. Respond with truth. Let people reveal themselves by the choices they have already made. Trust Daniel. He knows everything that needs to be done. I lowered the letter into my lap and stared quietly at the final signature. Daniel waited respectfully until I looked back toward him. Richard never wanted you to carry this burden while he was alive, he explained. He hoped the family would remain united after his passing. But he also believed preparation was an act of love, not suspicion. He finally opened the navy folder. Inside were organized documents, handwritten notes, copies of property records, trust agreements, and several dated letters. Everything had been prepared with extraordinary care. Daniel turned one page toward me. Your husband did not simply write a will. He established a family trust designed to preserve both the assets and the values that built them. Financial inheritance was only one part of his plan. I read the first page carefully. The language was formal, but one section had been highlighted in Richard's own handwriting. It explained that future distributions from the trust could be reconsidered if a beneficiary demonstrated sustained conduct that intentionally isolated, humiliated, manipulated, or exploited Evelyn Carter. The decision would not depend upon a single disagreement but upon a documented pattern of behavior evaluated through credible evidence and independent review. I looked up in surprise. He expected something like this? Daniel answered carefully. He hoped it would never become necessary. But over the final 2 years of his life, Richard quietly documented conversations that troubled him. He noticed repeated efforts to separate you from important family decisions. He believed those incidents might eventually become more serious. My thoughts immediately returned to the restaurant, the holidays, the school concert, and every small moment I had dismissed as coincidence. Daniel closed the folder without revealing everything inside. There is much more for us to discuss, he said. But not today. We must proceed carefully and honestly. This process cannot be driven by emotion. It must be supported by facts. I folded Richard's letter and placed it back inside the envelope with steady hands. For the first time since my husband passed away, I no longer felt as though I was walking alone through uncertainty. Richard had not left me a plan for revenge. He had left me a path toward truth, one careful step at a time, and somewhere beyond those carefully prepared pages I sensed that the family dinner had not marked the end of my place in the Carter family. It had merely uncovered the Beginning of a story Richard had quietly anticipated long before any of us realized it. I left Daniel's office carrying only a slim copy of several documents and Richard's letter, yet I felt as though the weight on my shoulders had somehow become lighter. The truth often works that way. It does not erase pain, but it replaces confusion with clarity. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the courthouse clock struck 11. People hurried through downtown carrying briefcases, shopping bags, and cups of coffee, each absorbed in lives that had nothing to do with mine. It reminded me that even the deepest personal heartbreak exists quietly alongside ordinary days. Richard used to say that life never pauses simply because our hearts do. I drove home by a different route than usual, taking the longer road that wound past the small lake where Richard and I had often walked after Sunday church services. The water reflected the clear autumn sky, and families fed ducks along the shoreline while children laughed nearby. I parked for a few minutes and watched them from inside the car. Once upon a time, Michael had stood on that very dock tossing breadcrumbs into the water while Richard patiently explained why the smallest actions revealed a person's character. Anyone can be kind when it is easy, he had told our son. Real character appears when kindness costs you something. I wondered whether Michael remembered those words. Or perhaps they had simply been buried beneath years of ambition and quiet compromise. When I arrived home, I placed Daniel's documents inside the same cedar cabinet where Richard had kept them in spirit all along. I locked the drawer, slipped the small brass key into my desk, and decided that from this moment forward I would change nothing about my daily routine. That decision surprised even me. Part of me wanted to confront Michael immediately. Another part wanted to send Ashley a copy of Richard's letter and ask whether humiliating an elderly woman had been worth it. But neither impulse belonged to the woman Richard had loved. He had asked me to answer with truth, not anger. Truth required patience. The following morning my telephone rang shortly after. 10. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering in my usual calm voice. Good morning. There was a brief pause before he spoke. Mom, I wanted to check on you. His words sounded careful, almost rehearsed. That is thoughtful of you, I replied. How are you feeling after everything? I looked out the kitchen window toward Richard's rose garden. I am doing just fine. Another pause followed. Ashley thinks things became emotional at dinner. She probably chose the wrong words. I noticed that he had not apologized. Instead, he had apologized for her choice of words, as though the problem had been vocabulary rather than intention. Did she? I asked gently. Michael sighed. You know how stressful these events can become. There were clients there, business partners. Everyone was under pressure. I quietly stirred my tea without responding. After several uncomfortable seconds, he continued. Anyway, Ashley is already moving on. I think it would be best if we all just forgot about it. Forgot about it. Such a simple phrase. Yet I realized that forgetting had become the foundation upon which every previous insult had quietly rested. Forget the missed holiday. Forget the changed invitation. Forget the school concert. Forget being seated at the end of the table. Forget being invisible. Forget being called a beggar in front of relatives and strangers alike. Every forgotten wound had made room for another. I understand, I finally answered. I hope you both have a pleasant week. Before he could say anything else, I politely ended the call. Less than an hour later, my neighbor Helen stopped by with a loaf of homemade banana bread, something she often baked whenever she believed someone needed company more than conversation. Helen had lived across the street for nearly 20 years. She never enjoyed gossip, but she possessed remarkable instincts about people. We sat together on the back porch overlooking the garden. I heard your family gathered at Hawthorne House, she said cautiously. I smiled faintly. News travels quickly. Helen hesitated before speaking again. One of my friends was celebrating an anniversary in the next dining room. She recognized you. I remained silent. She said you walked out with your head held high. She also said the security guard looked more embarrassed than you did. I could not help smiling at that. He was very respectful. Helen reached across the small table and gently squeezed my hand. Evelyn, dignity has a strange way of making rude people look even smaller. We spent another hour talking about ordinary things. The weather. Her grandchildren. The church food pantry. Not once did she encourage revenge. Not once did she criticize Ashley or Michael. Somehow that made her kindness even more comforting. After Helen left, I found myself thinking about Richard's words once again. Let people reveal themselves by the choices they have already made. I realized I no longer needed to search for proof of anyone's character. They were providing it willingly through every conversation, every excuse, and every decision. Late that afternoon another call arrived, this time from Ashley. Her cheerful voice sounded almost effortless. Hello, Evelyn. I just wanted to let you know that Michael and I are thinking about hosting another family gathering in a few weeks. We would love for everyone to move forward. There it was again. Move forward. Not apologize. Not acknowledge. Simply move beyond something they hoped would disappear with time. That sounds nice, I answered pleasantly. I hope everything works out exactly as planned. Ashley laughed softly, clearly satisfied by my response. I knew you would understand. After ending the call, I placed the telephone on the kitchen counter and looked toward the cedar cabinet one more time. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed kindness meant forgetfulness. Most of all, they believed the story had already reached its conclusion. They had no idea that Richard's careful preparation had quietly shifted the beginning of the story to a place only he had seen coming, and with each passing day they continued walking confidently toward consequences they had unknowingly chosen for themselves. I settled into a quiet rhythm over the next 2 weeks, not because life had suddenly become peaceful, but because I understood that patience was now my greatest ally. Every morning I watered Richard's roses before the sun climbed too high, answered a few calls from friends at church, and spent an hour organizing old family records in the study. To anyone watching from the outside, I looked exactly as I always had. That appearance mattered. Richard often reminded me that people revealed far more when they believed no one was paying attention. Daniel and I spoke twice during those 2 weeks, always by appointment and always briefly. He explained that the trust Richard had established required facts rather than assumptions. Every concern had to be supported by documented patterns instead of emotional reactions. That approach comforted me because it reflected the values Richard had lived by. He believed fairness protected everyone, including those who had made poor choices. One afternoon Daniel called with a quiet update. I have finished reviewing your husband's notes alongside the trust documents, he said. Everything was prepared carefully. There is no need to rush. Continue living your life naturally. If additional information becomes relevant, it will come on its own. I thanked him and ended the call feeling strangely calm. The truth no longer depended on convincing anyone. It simply needed time to surface. 3 days later I received an invitation from my oldest granddaughter, Emma. She asked whether I could attend her school art exhibition on Friday evening. The invitation had arrived by electronic mail from the school itself rather than through Ashley, which immediately caught my attention. I replied that I would be honored to come. Friday evening arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. The elementary school gymnasium had been transformed into a cheerful gallery filled with colorful paintings, handmade sculptures, and proud families carrying paper cups of lemonade. Emma spotted me almost immediately and ran toward me with the wide smile I remembered from years earlier. She wrapped both arms around my waist before stepping back to show me her watercolor painting of a lakeside sunset. I hoped you would come this time, Grandma, she said innocently. Her words lingered in my heart. Because they carried no accusation, only relief. I would not miss it, I answered honestly. As we admired her artwork together, Ashley approached with measured confidence. Anyone watching us would have assumed we shared a warm relationship. She greeted several parents before turning toward me with a polished smile. I am so glad you made it, she said loudly enough for nearby families to hear. We have all been worried about you since the dinner. I simply smiled. That is kind of you. She seemed slightly disappointed that I offered nothing more. After a few moments she excused herself to speak with another group of parents. Emma leaned closer and lowered her voice. Grandma? Yes, sweetheart. I wanted you to know something. She glanced around to make certain no adults were listening. Mom told me not to send you the invitation because she said you were probably too busy. But my teacher helped me find your electronic mail address from the emergency contact form. My heart ached, not because of anger, but because an 11-year-old child had quietly corrected an unfair situation without fully understanding it. I gently squeezed her hand. Thank you for telling me. I am very proud of your painting. She smiled again and hurried back to her classmates. I never mentioned our conversation to Ashley. There was no need. Another small piece had quietly found its place. The following Monday I met Helen for coffee at a neighborhood cafe. As we talked, she casually mentioned seeing a real estate consultant leaving Michael's office building the previous week. Maybe they are buying a larger house, she wondered aloud. I did not speculate. Instead, I simply listened. Later that afternoon Daniel telephoned again. I have scheduled a formal trust review meeting for next month, he explained. All primary beneficiaries will be invited. It is a routine provision required every few years, so no one should find it unusual. Will I need to prepare anything? I asked. Only yourself, he replied. Everything else has already been prepared over many years. After ending the call, I sat quietly beside the living room window where Richard and I had once watched countless sunsets. Together. I realized something important. I had spent years believing that keeping the peace meant remaining silent whenever I was treated unfairly. Richard had understood something I was only beginning to learn. Peace built upon dishonesty was never true peace. It merely delayed necessary truth. That evening my telephone rang once more. Michael sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, I wanted to let you know Ashley and I have been discussing some exciting plans for the future. Things are finally coming together. I am glad to hear that, I replied sincerely. You deserve to be happy. He laughed softly. You always believe in me. I looked toward Richard's photograph resting quietly on the mantel. I always hoped you would become the man your father believed you could be. There was a brief silence before Michael changed the subject. We ended the conversation politely, yet something in his voice suggested complete confidence that the future belonged exactly where he expected it to belong. I wished him a pleasant evening and placed the phone back on its cradle. Outside, the first leaves of autumn drifted gently across the lawn. Seasons changed gradually, almost unnoticed from one day to the next, until suddenly the entire landscape looked different. Families, I realized, often changed the same way. Small choices accumulated quietly until one day the truth stood plainly before everyone. The meeting Daniel had scheduled was now only a few weeks away, and while Michael and Ashley confidently planned their future, neither of them understood that Richard had spent his final years preparing not only to protect his life's work, but also to protect the values upon which our family had once been built. I arrived at Daniel Brooks's office on the morning of the trust review 15 minutes before the scheduled time. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the courthouse square across the street bustled with people beginning another ordinary business day. I wondered how many of them realized that lives could quietly change inside conference rooms where no voices were ever raised. Daniel's receptionist greeted me with the same warm smile she always offered. Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Mr. Brooks asked that you make yourself comfortable. Everyone else has not arrived yet. I thanked her and settled into one of the leather chairs overlooking the parking lot. A few minutes later Daniel stepped into the reception area carrying a neatly organized binder. You look exactly like Richard used to before important meetings, he said with a gentle smile. Calm on the outside and prepared on the inside. I smiled back. I learned from a very good teacher. He nodded approvingly. Remember what we discussed. Today is not about winning. It is about allowing the documents to speak for themselves. I assured him I understood. Soon afterward the front door opened again. Michael walked inside first, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying the confidence of someone who believed the future had already been decided. Ashley followed beside him in an elegant cream-colored dress, smiling politely at the receptionist before finally noticing me. For just a fraction of a second, surprise crossed her face. It disappeared almost immediately beneath the polished expression she showed the world. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said pleasantly, as though nothing uncomfortable had ever happened between us. "Good morning, Ashley," I replied with equal courtesy. Michael approached and leaned down to kiss my cheek. "Mom, it is good to see you." I looked into his eyes, searching for the little boy who had once proudly held my hand while crossing busy streets. Instead, I found a man who seemed eager for the meeting to begin, though not because he wished to repair our relationship. He believed there was something waiting for him on the other side of those conference room doors. "You look well," he said. "Thank you," I answered. "I hope you do too." The conversation ended there. Ashley quietly opened her tablet computer while Michael checked messages on his telephone. Neither of them appeared nervous. In fact, they looked almost relaxed. That confidence told me more than words ever could. A few moments later, William Harris arrived carrying his weathered leather briefcase. Richard's longtime business partner smiled warmly when he saw me. "Evelyn," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Richard would be proud of how gracefully you have handled yourself these past few weeks." Ashley glanced briefly toward William before returning to her tablet. I wondered whether she realized how many people Richard had trusted throughout his lifetime. Daniel soon invited everyone into the conference room. Sunlight poured through the large windows, illuminating the polished walnut table where thick folders had already been placed in front of every chair. Small nameplates identified each participant. My seat remained beside Daniel's, exactly where Richard would have wanted me to sit. Michael and Ashley settled across from us. William sat near the opposite end of the table, quietly reviewing several pages inside his folder. Daniel waited until everyone had taken their seats before speaking. "Thank you all for attending today's scheduled trust administration review. As many of you know, Richard Carter established the Carter Family Trust several years before his passing. One provision requires periodic review whenever significant administrative matters arise or beneficiary circumstances require clarification." Ashley smiled confidently. "Richard was always very thorough," she commented. "He certainly was," Daniel replied evenly. "His planning reflected not only financial priorities but also deeply held family principles." Michael leaned back comfortably in his chair. "I imagine this is mostly procedural." Daniel folded his hands. "Some portions are. Others deserve careful discussion." The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel opened the master binder before him and began reviewing several routine matters first. Property maintenance reports. Investment summaries. Charitable contributions Richard had requested continue after his death. Everything proceeded exactly as any ordinary trust meeting might. Ashley occasionally nodded while Michael signed acknowledgement forms placed before him. If anyone had entered the room at that moment, they would have assumed the meeting would conclude within another 30 minutes. Then Daniel carefully closed one folder and opened another bound in dark blue leather. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. The next matter concerns a section of the trust that Richard instructed should only be reviewed under specific circumstances. Michael straightened slightly in his chair. Ashley looked up from her notes for the first time in several minutes. Daniel continued speaking in the same calm voice. Richard believed that financial inheritance should never become separated from personal responsibility. For that reason, he established a series of conduct provisions applicable to all primary beneficiaries. William quietly removed his reading glasses and placed them on the table, saying nothing. Daniel looked toward me briefly before continuing. These provisions were never intended as punishment. They were designed to preserve the values upon which Richard believed this family had been built. Michael exchanged a quick glance with Ashley. Neither of them appeared concerned. In fact, Ashley offered a faint smile as though expecting another routine explanation about charitable giving or stewardship. Daniel slowly turned another page inside the binder. "Before we proceed further," he said, Richard directed that several documented observations, correspondence, and supporting materials first be entered into the administrative record for review. The confidence I had seen on Michael's face remained unchanged. Ashley folded her hands neatly on the table, completely unaware that the careful certainty she carried into the room was about to meet truths that had been quietly waiting for this exact morning long before any of us realized how important this meeting would eventually become. I watched Daniel remove a sealed envelope from the dark blue binder before placing it carefully in the center of the conference table. No one spoke. Even the quiet hum of the heating system seemed louder than before. Daniel looked around the room, making eye contact with each of us before he finally began reading from Richard's written instructions. "If this section of the trust is ever opened," he said, "it means there is reason to determine whether my greatest inheritance, the values of this family, has been protected as faithfully as my financial assets." I lowered my eyes for a moment as Richard's familiar words filled the room. It felt almost as though he were sitting beside us once again, speaking with the same calm confidence that had guided our family for decades. Daniel continued. Richard further instructed that no conclusion should ever be based upon a single disagreement. Instead, every decision must rely upon documented patterns, independent observations, and verifiable facts. Michael shifted slightly in his chair, though his expression remained composed. Ashley folded her hands neatly together and waited with quiet confidence. Daniel opened the first folder. Over the final 24 months of his life, Richard personally documented concerns regarding repeated efforts to isolate Evelyn Carter from family traditions, decision-making, and meaningful participation in family life. He placed several dated pages onto the table. They contained Richard's handwritten observations, each one carefully dated and signed. Daniel read several entries aloud. One described a holiday gathering where seating arrangements had been deliberately changed to separate me from my grandchildren. Another noted conversations in which invitations had been redirected or quietly withheld. A third described Richard's concern that seemingly minor incidents were becoming increasingly consistent rather than accidental. William Harris nodded slowly as Daniel read each page. "I remember discussing these concerns with Richard," William said calmly. He hoped he was mistaken. Unfortunately, he rarely was when it came to reading people. Ashley finally leaned forward. "With respect," she said politely, "those notes represent personal opinions. Families sometimes have misunderstandings. Surely that is not enough to question anyone's inheritance." Daniel acknowledged her point with a slight nod. "Standing alone, you would be correct. Which is precisely why Richard required independent supporting material." He opened a second folder. Several events were witnessed by individuals who had no financial interest whatsoever in this trust. He began reading written statements collected over different periods of time. A former church coordinator described my unexpected exclusion from volunteer recognition despite years of service after another family member insisted attendance would only complicate scheduling. A school administrator confirmed that I had not received information about one of Emma's performances because my contact details had been removed from the preferred family notification list, although I remained listed as an emergency contact. Helen had provided a written statement describing conversations we shared after the restaurant incident, carefully limiting her comments to facts she had personally observed rather than assumptions. None of the statements sounded dramatic. Their quiet consistency made them far more powerful. Michael's confidence began to fade. He looked from one document to another before finally turning toward Ashley. She remained composed, but I noticed the first hint of uncertainty in her eyes. Daniel then opened the final folder. The last item concerns the family dinner held at Hawthorne House. Ashley immediately straightened in her chair. "That situation has already been misunderstood," she said. "Everyone was under pressure." Daniel looked at her kindly. That possibility was considered. He reached into the folder and produced a typed incident report from the restaurant's management. Following the event, management conducted an internal review after one of their employees expressed concern regarding the treatment of a guest. He read portions of the report describing how multiple staff members independently confirmed hearing the request for security to remove me from the private dining room. The report further noted that I had remained calm, cooperative, and respectful throughout the incident, while the assigned security employee specifically declined to physically intervene because I had already chosen to leave voluntarily and had not created any disturbance. Daniel placed the report beside the other documents. The restaurant also confirmed that several guests from neighboring dining rooms later contacted management expressing concern about what they witnessed. Ashley opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Michael slowly rubbed his forehead as though trying to assemble pieces of a story he had never expected to hear from anyone except himself. Daniel remained patient. Richard required independent corroboration before any conduct provision could ever be considered. That standard has now been satisfied. He carefully turned to the final page inside the binder. Accordingly, under Section 8 of the Carter Family Trust, the trustee is required to determine whether sustained conduct inconsistent with the family's stated principles has occurred. William quietly cleared his throat. Richard and I built our company together over 35 years, he said. He often reminded me that wealth could recover from poor investments, but families rarely recovered from the loss of respect. That was the one asset he refused to compromise. The room fell completely silent. No one argued. No one raised a voice. There was only the unmistakable weight of carefully preserved truth resting before us on polished walnut. Daniel closed the binder with deliberate care. The administrative review is not yet complete, he said evenly. Each beneficiary will have an opportunity to respond in accordance with the trust procedures before final determinations are issued. Michael looked toward me for the first time since the meeting began, and the confidence that had filled his face earlier that morning had completely disappeared. Ashley stared silently at the stack of documents in front of her as though seeing them for the first time. Neither of them had expected that years of seemingly insignificant choices had quietly formed a record far more enduring than memory itself. And as I sat beside Richard's empty chair in spirit, I realized he had not built this trust merely to distribute property. He had built it to preserve the one inheritance he believed mattered most, the character of the family that carried his name. I remained seated while the room settled into a silence unlike any I had ever experienced. It was not the uncomfortable silence that follows an argument, nor the awkward silence of strangers with nothing left to say. It was the quiet that arrives when truth finally reaches people who have spent years avoiding it. Daniel carefully gathered the documents into neat stacks before looking toward Michael and Ashley. According to the trust procedures, he said calmly, all beneficiaries have 30 days to submit written responses. After that period, the trustee will issue the final administrative determination based upon the governing documents and supporting evidence. Michael nodded almost absent-mindedly. The confidence that had filled his voice only an hour earlier had completely disappeared. Ashley remained perfectly still, staring at the polished table as though hoping the pages before her might somehow tell a different story if she looked long enough. Daniel officially concluded the meeting, and everyone slowly stood. William Harris approached me first. He smiled with the same quiet kindness Richard had always admired. He would have been proud of you today, William said softly. Not because of what happened in this room, but because you never allowed bitterness to decide your next step. I thanked him, and he gently squeezed my shoulder before leaving. Daniel walked me toward the reception area. You handled everything exactly as Richard hoped you would, he said. The hardest part is often remaining calm when emotions invite us to become someone we are not. I smiled. I finally understand why he prepared all of this so carefully. Daniel nodded. He was never protecting money. He was protecting your dignity. As I stepped outside, I heard footsteps behind me. Michael called my name. I turned and found him standing alone in the afternoon sunlight. For a moment neither of us spoke. He looked older than he had that morning. Mom, he finally said, I did not know about any of those documents. I believed him. Richard had trusted very few people with the full details of the trust, and Michael's surprise had seemed genuine throughout the meeting. I know, I answered quietly. He lowered his eyes. I kept telling myself everything was just family stress. Every holiday. Every dinner. Every excuse. I kept believing it was easier not to ask questions. I studied the face of the little boy I had once raised, now hidden beneath years of poor decisions. Sometimes silence becomes a decision of its own, I said gently. Tears gathered in his eyes, though he quickly brushed them away. Can you ever forgive me? I took a slow breath before answering. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I chose forgiveness a long time ago because I refused to carry resentment through the rest of my life. Trust, however, must be rebuilt one honest choice at a time. He nodded without arguing. For the first time in many years, he did not search for excuses. He simply accepted responsibility for his own choices. Ashley never came outside. I did not wait for her. There were conversations each of us would eventually have to face, but they belonged to another day. 37 days later, Daniel invited everyone back to his office for the trustees' final determination. The review concluded that Richard's conduct provisions had indeed been triggered by a documented pattern of behavior rather than a single isolated incident. Certain discretionary distributions that Michael and Ashley had expected would no longer pass to them under the original terms. Instead, a significant portion of Richard's estate would remain protected within the family trust and be redirected according to the charitable and educational purposes he had carefully outlined years before. Scholarships for local trade students. Grants supporting community libraries. Assistance for senior programs at our church. Maintenance of the Carter Family Foundation that Richard had quietly established before his passing. Michael accepted the decision without protest. Ashley remained silent throughout the meeting. I felt no satisfaction in watching their disappointment because Richard had taught me that another person's loss could never become the foundation of lasting peace. Nearly a year passed. The roses outside my home bloomed once again. Emma visited often, usually bringing new paintings to show me before proudly hanging them on my refrigerator. Michael began stopping by on Sunday afternoons with nothing more than 2 cups of coffee and an honest willingness to sit quietly on the back porch where his father and I had spent so many evenings together. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather. His work. Emma's school projects. Slowly, without forcing anything, we began rebuilding a relationship that no legal document could ever restore by itself. Ashley remained distant. I wished her no harm. I simply accepted that every adult must eventually live with the consequences of the values they choose each day. One evening, as the sun settled behind Richard's rose garden, I sat beside his photograph with the same letter that had changed everything resting gently in my lap. I smiled at the familiar handwriting before placing it back inside the cedar cabinet where it belonged. Richard had once told me that a family's greatest inheritance was never measured in dollars, homes, or investments. It was measured in the respect people offered one another when no reward was waiting in return. I finally understood what he meant. That night at the restaurant they believed they had removed an unwanted guest from their table. In reality, they had only revealed who truly belonged at it all along, and from that day forward I never questioned my worth again because dignity, once protected by truth, becomes something no one else has the power to take away.